If you have a police department that has a kind of militaristic mindset, has a, us versus them, sees the people they serve as potential enemies, not, citizens with rights, it doesn't matter what kind of gun they're armed with, you're going to have problems.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie for Reason TV, and today we're talking with Radley Balko. He's a journalist, blogger at the Washington Post, late of the Huffington Post, late of Reason, has also worked at Cato. Radley, thanks for talking to us.
My pleasure. Welcome to Nashville.
Yeah, well, explain what you do. You write for the Washington Post, but you're based in Nashville.
Right.
How does that work for you?
Well, actually, I lived in D.C. for 10 years and didn't get hired by the Washington Post until I moved away, which I always find amusing. But yeah, I work here. I cover, criminal justice issues, civil liberties issues, but kind of with a national focus. So there's really no reason for me to be in D.C. So yeah, I work remotely. It's great. I like it.
Do you do you have staff meetings and stuff like that?
Nope. I don't think I've had a meeting since I started.
Do you even read the Washington Post?
I do read the Washington. I read online. I actually don't get the paper delivered. But yeah, obviously I read it online, and when I'm in DC, I always read it.
Obviously, starting with your work at the Cato Institute, where you wrote particularly a study called Overkill that was about kind of the rise and the ubiquity of militarized policing and no-knock raids and raids gone wrong. You worked at Reason for a number of years and wrote stories in that vein, went to the Huffington Post, now at the Washington Post. What is your sense? We are living now in a world where the issues that you had laid out more than a decade ago are really in the forefront. Reform efforts are starting. I mean, do you feel like things are going in the right direction, or are we missing the boat on what's going on?
I think the discussion's moving in the right direction. I mean, I think people are finally paying attention to these issues. I think people are finally a little more skeptical of this kind of stuff. I remember writing in the book, Rise of the Warrior Cop, about a raid that was broadcast on network TV in the early 90s, where the Clinton administration had just introduced this policy of zero tolerance of drugs in federally funded public housing. I remember there was this raid, and it was really violent, and there were children, everyone's thrown to the ground. They find this tiny little bit of pot, and you would think it would be sort of embarrassing for the police because it was all these guns, all this commotion. They find this little bit of personal use marijuana, and it was sort of celebrated on the news as finally, finally we got these bastards, and they're all gonna be evicted, and it was there's a single mother and a few kids, and it's probably one of her kids' friends' pot. And I think today, like you show that, I think people would be angry. I think that video would go viral. People would be really upset about it.
Right. So it would be used as a point against the police rather than a celebration of we're taking back our cities.
Exactly. But I think policy-wise, I don't think things are getting all that better. I think Obama did a couple of kind of important passed a couple of important symbolic policies, limiting what kind of gear can go to police departments from the military. And it made a lot of sense. I think they're already reconsidering it. There was a lot of backlash from police groups.
And it's clear that the police themselves, I mean, they're still putting raids online and whatnot, right? Where they take their head cam footage and stuff like that and put it online.
Well, I think they're much more reluctant to. I think they do kind of know, they are aware of the bad optics of these kind of operations, and particularly when they don't find anything, or particularly for nonviolent crimes. I mean, the idea that they're still kicking down people's doors and shooting dogs and throwing people on the floor at gunpoint over a drug that's now legal in 3 or 4 states is, it's absurd, but yeah, it does still happen. It definitely still happens. People are still getting killed in these raids.
Do you had talked about the kind of policies from DC-based policies that were giving essentially surplus military hardware and software and everything to local police departments. How much is the technology driving policy? I mean, is it that police start looking like soldiers, so they start acting like soldiers, or is it that they are thinking like soldiers and that's why they're getting this stuff on?
I think it's both. I think each drives the other. I mean, I think it's useful to think about the police militarization issue that way. I think there is the issue of the gear. Is a grenade launcher appropriate in domestic policing? Is an MRAP appropriate in domestic policing? But more than that, I think that the mentality is really more concerning than even the gear. Gear is sort of, except for maybe a grenade launcher, a taser is a pretty innocuous thing. It's the policies that govern it. It's how it's used once it's in operation. And if you have police department that has a kind of militaristic mindset, has a, us versus them, sees the people they serve as potential enemies, not, citizens with rights, it doesn't matter what kind of gun they're armed with, you're going to have problems.
Well, it's interesting in the 2016 presidential election, for the first time really since the 90s, crime is it's a presidential issue. Donald Trump has announced again and again that he's the law and order candidate. He's calling to mind Richard Nixon in particular in the late 60s and early 70s when crime was really rising to historic levels. Hillary Clinton, of course, is known in the late 90s or in the 90s, talked a lot about super predators. Her husband was tough on crime. That's how he showed he was a different type of Democrat. What is the reality of crime in America now versus, say, 10 or 15 years ago? And are we acting as if there's a crime surge when there isn't? Or are we actually, are people like Trump and some urban mayors and whatnot, when they start talking about, holy cow, crime is coming back? What is going on, and how should we be talking about this in a more productive way?
So crime's been dropping for about 20 years. Violent crime's been dropping for about 20 years. There has been a bit of a leveling off, and then a bit of an uptick probably in the last 2 years. It's still, the uptick still puts us at where we were in, say, 2011 or 2012. So it's not as if, crime is sort of spiraling out of control. If it is going back up again, it could be something to worry about. It could also just be crime wasn't ever going to continue declining to zero, right? And at some point, there's going to be leveling off, and it could just be statistical noise. There are cities where, we are seeing massive spikes in violent crime, and that's concerning. But I think there are explanations, there are localized explanations for that.
Talk a little bit about, why did, in your estimation, and, criminologists are kind of all over the map, and a lot of them are like, we don't really have a good explanation, but why do you think crime from the mid-90s declined so much overall, but especially violent crime? And then, what are some of those local issues that are driving it up in places like Chicago, is probably the best known example.
Why crime dropped, as you said, there are lots of different competing theories. I mean, those I found most convincing, probably some combination of rising standard of living, just kind of general standard of living. I actually think I've seen convincing arguments that removal of lead from like paint and drinking water may have had something to do with it. And then just an aging population. If you look at sort of the graph of when people commit crimes, it's always in the late teens to about 28, 29, and then it drops off dramatically.
Do you think, and I think we totally agree that it's over-incarceration, but, locking up more and more people of that age, is that also part of the reason why crime went down?
The studies I've seen, it puts it about, the incarceration about is responsible for about 10 to 15% of the crime drop. So it, it wasn't insignificant, but crime also dropped dramatically in Canada, for example, over the same period, and they weren't locking up people at nearly the rate we were. So it's not exclusive, but yeah, it did contribute, absolutely.
So then in places like Chicago, which again, the murder rate is, and the total number of murders much lower than it was at its peak, but it's up a lot from over a couple of years ago. What are some of these local conditions that are giving rise to?
So there's a great book called American Homicide by Randall Roth, who's a historian at Ohio State University. And one of his theories that I find pretty compelling is this idea that if the citizenry sort of believes that the government is illegitimate, if they think that if there's it's not even a matter of trust in government, it's a matter of doubting the government's legitimacy, you see homicide rates spike. So now if you look at the places where we've seen, large increases in homicide over the last couple of years, you've got, Baltimore, where you had a mayor who was indicted not too long ago. You had a policy throughout the 90s of just mass arrests where, the Justice Department report on the police department last year was one of the most earlier this year, scathing and blistering that I've ever seen. You can make a good argument that there's not a whole lot of faith in the sort of legitimacy of government there. Same thing in St. Louis. I wrote about the sort of predatory nature of the municipal courts in St. Louis. I think it's 70, 80 municipalities in St. Louis County, and it's this sort of weird quirk of history and white flight and sort of racist boundary drawing. But basically, because of all that, you've got this county where there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of little municipalities. You can drive down a 10-mile stretch of a highway in St. Louis County and drive through 25 different cities, and each of them has their own police force. And serious crimes are investigated by the St. Louis Police Department. The only job of these little tiny police departments is to generate revenue to keep their governments afloat and to keep paychecks coming. And so basically it becomes this antagonistic relationship between the citizens and the police, where the cops they just look for things to write people up for. And if you, yeah, as you said, if you get a fine, you don't show up to court, then you get an arrest warrant. There are counties or municipalities in St. Louis County where there are 5 or 6, 7 outstanding arrest warrants for every person that lives in the county. So you can see, that's clearly a jurisdiction or place in this country where there's very little faith or trust in the sort of legitimacy of government. Same thing in Chicago. Chicago Police Department is notoriously corrupt. Chicago government's notoriously corrupt. So I find it to be a pretty fascinating, possible explanation for this. It's kind of
What is the solution to that then? I mean, how do you re-legitimize government? Do you do like actual reform and kind of a broom sweeps clean type of thing, or?
I think I think the prescriptions would vary based on the city. I mean, in St. Louis County, they just need to eliminate a lot of these municipalities. There's just no reason for them to exist. I think, Baltimore, revamping the police department. I mean, you're obviously never going to solve sort of corruption in government, but, you can have police departments that aren't, as antagonistic, that don't have arrest quotas, that don't do, warrant, what do they call them, warrant sweeps, so they're just going to go and do these massive sweeps in entire neighborhoods and just look for people who have outstanding warrants. So yeah, those kinds of policies that are more oriented toward, I'll give you a good example here in Nashville. We have a great police chief here. Some people might disagree, but a couple years after he took office, he had pointed out that I think it was 2 out of every 3 times one of his officers pulled somebody over, they got a warning and not an actual ticket, which, is a good thing. But then his philosophy behind it is what was really sort of encouraging, which is that, he said the job of the police department is to keep the roads safe. It's not to generate revenue for the city. And I think changing that, outlook, that kind of philosophy, that cities should not be relying on fines and court fees, as a line item in their budget.
Do you think Barack Obama has he been good or bad for kind of crime and its intersection with race relations?
I mean, I think Obama has in some ways been kind of revolutionary in that he has said things that no sitting president has ever said before. And Eric Holder, as a sitting attorney general, has said things like, that just acknowledging over incarceration, or that mass incarceration is a problem, that it has devastated, certain communities in the U.S. Acknowledging the sort of injustice of civil asset forfeiture, that it's often unjustly applied. Just the very notion that a president would say something like that. The militarization issue. That said, most of the revolutionary aspects of his administration have been about saying things and not necessarily doing things, and not actually implementing policies to kind of back up those. Now, he has done some things. The reining in the Pentagon giveaways. Again, that was kind of symbolic, because at this point, most police departments get their gear through the Department of Homeland Security or through donations. It's not, the Pentagon's actually played a huge role in getting the trend started, but it doesn't contribute all that much anymore. As far as race relations, I don't know how qualified I am to comment on that. In certain ways, it was always going to be bad, because I think there's a certain segment of the population that was never going to be happy with a black president, no matter who it was.
Let's close by talking about the stakes of election 2016. Obviously, you're a small L libertarian. So do you have somebody that you are voting for in this election? And that's kind of to flip your personal bias. But then, is there, what is the best outcome for the issues you care about? Things like criminal justice reform, things like getting police into a better place with the populations that they help surveil.
So I'll be voting for Gary Johnson again, and I no qualms about that at all. As for the Trump versus Hillary, I mean, I think I'm quoted in the magazine as saying I think they would both be terrible, but I think Trump would be catastrophic. I think Hillary would just be sort of just another terrible president. For criminal justice issues, and specifically, Trump is basically telling us how terrible he's going to be on these issues. So I don't think there's any reason to not take him at his word on that. Hillary Clinton has a bad past. I think she has, decided that it is now politically safe for her to, embrace some of these issues. How much political capital she's willing to spend on it, who knows? I mean, she's also a very divisive figure, so I could see her trying to push these issues, causing the Republicans in Congress to sort of double down and just for the sake of opposing her. I'm not particularly optimistic. I think most of the really significant change in criminal justice reform is going to come at the local level, not even the state level. I think it's going to come in cities and sheriffs. We're starting to see criminal justice reform become an election issue in DA's races, in sheriff's races, sometimes even in state legislature races. But we've seen lots of district attorneys over the last couple of years actually go down because their histories. You had Anita Alvarez in Chicago. I can't think of his name. The prosecutor in Cleveland lost after his decision in the Tamir Rice case. So we're seeing I've always thought that was kind of the missing piece in the criminal justice reform movement, is that there was no political activism. And if you're in one of those positions, one of those elected positions, there are lots of people who are going to vote for you because they see you as too soft on crime, until there's sort of a political penalty for overcorrecting there. I don't think we're going to see any change. So that's been a really encouraging development.
Well, we'll leave it there. We've been talking with Radley Balko of the Washington Post, late of Reason. Radley, thanks for talking to us.
My pleasure.
For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.